My name is Lily Chen, and I am 30 years old. 18 months ago, I started saving money for the one thing my parents had talked about wanting for as long as I could remember: a trip to Hawaii. Not a weekend getaway, not a budget vacation. The real thing. A full 2-week trip with the extended family, the flights, the hotels, the activities, the meals, all of it. My parents had mentioned Hawaii at least once a year for my entire childhood, always in the way people mention things they have decided they cannot have: wistfully, briefly, then moving on before the wanting became too heavy to carry. By the time I was done saving, I had set aside $14,000. I booked the flights, the hotel suites, the luau, the snorkeling tour, the sunset dinner cruise, the van rental to drive the road to Hana. I coordinated travel schedules for 11 people across 3 cities. I handled every reservation, every confirmation email, every logistical detail from the first deposit to the airport pickup. I did all of this without telling most of the family what I was doing, because I wanted it to be a gift rather than a transaction. What I did not know was that my older brother Marcus had been telling the extended family for weeks that he had organized the vacation. Not vaguely, not ambiguously. Specifically, in detail, with the confidence of someone who believed the lie he was telling or had simply decided it did not matter. When our aunts and cousins gathered for the welcome dinner on the first night of the trip and spent the better part of an hour calling Marcus the hero of the family, the best son anyone had ever had, the most thoughtful man they knew, I sat at the end of the table in the place I had always occupied, in my family, and said nothing. Then my mother, who had been quiet throughout the entire dinner, set down her water glass, looked around the table slowly, and said something that changed the temperature of that room in about 3 seconds. Before I tell you what she said, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely means something to you. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. I love knowing where you are watching from, and I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the family I grew up in, to the brother who learned very early that the telling of things mattered more than the doing of them, and to the mother who had been watching both of us for 30 years and had simply been waiting for the right moment. Growing up in the Chen household meant growing up in a family where love was abundant and attention was unevenly distributed, which is a combination that produces a very specific kind of child, the kind who learns to measure their worth in what they contribute rather than in what they receive. Marcus was 4 years older than me, the firstborn son in a Chinese-American family where that phrase carried weight that nobody needed to explain and everyone understood. He was sharp and funny and socially gifted in the way that made him the natural center of any gathering, the one people leaned toward, the one the aunts asked about first when they called the house, the one my father mentioned when he talked about the family to his friends. I was the second child, the daughter, the one who studied harder and said less and received praise that was genuine but brief, because my achievements were the expected kind: a good student, a responsible person, someone who handled things without needing to be asked. People said these things about me warmly and moved on, because competence of that variety was comfortable to receive and did not require the particular quality of attention that Marcus's personality naturally commanded. I built my adult life on what I was naturally inclined toward: precision, care, the sustained work of doing things properly. I worked as a project manager for a technology company, and was good at it in the quiet way of people who are good at things without needing to announce it. I saved money carefully. I lived within my means. I was the daughter my parents called when something needed to be handled, and I handled it. And I genuinely did not mind the handling, because the handling was its own form of love. What I minded, quietly, in the place where I kept the things I noticed and did not say anything about, was the gap between what I contributed and what was acknowledged. Not because I needed continuous praise, but because there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being reliably useful to people you love, without any of them pausing to notice that the reliability came from a person, with a person's need to be seen. Marcus was always being seen. He told stories. He made announcements. He called a family with news in a way that turned the news into an event, generated excitement, produced the kind of response that made him feel like the center of something warm. He was not a bad person. I want to be very clear about that, because this story is not about a villain. He was a person who had learned that presence and performance generated attention, and attention felt like love, and so he had built his life around generating both. The vacation was the moment that exposed the gap between who performed the love and who actually gave it. My mother understood the difference. She had always understood it. She had simply not yet decided to say so out loud. The idea of the Hawaii trip had been living in our family for as long as I could remember. Always in the same place, the list of things we would do someday, when the timing was better, when the money was easier, when life had arrived at the right season. I had heard my parents mention it at least once a year for my entire childhood. My mother would bring it up in the particular way she brought up things she had already half-released. Not as a plan, not as a request, just as a thing that existed somewhere in the space of what might have been nice. My father would nod. The conversation would move on. By the time I was 28, I had decided that someday was not a real destination, and that if Hawaii was going to happen, it was going to happen because someone made it happen. The question was whether I was the someone. I sat with that question for about 2 weeks, and then the answer resolved itself the way answers do when you've already known them and are just waiting to admit it. Of course, I was the someone. I was always the someone. The question was not who would do it, but how large I was going to do it. I wanted to do it large. I wanted to do it in a way that my parents would talk about for the rest of their lives. I wanted the whole extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins together in one place, the kind of trip that became a chapter in the family story rather than a footnote. I opened a separate savings account the following Monday and started depositing a specific amount from every paycheck. 3 months into the saving, I mentioned it to Marcus. I had been on the phone with him about something else entirely when I told him, almost in passing, that I was planning the family Hawaii trip and that I was going to need him to help coordinate with our aunts and uncles about dates and availability since he was closer to them than I was. He was quiet for a moment and then he said,
Hawaii? That's a big deal, Lily. How much is this going to cost? Do you want to split it? I can put in whatever you need from my end.
I told him the projected cost and said I had been saving for months and intended to cover it myself, but that I needed his help with the family coordination side. He agreed. We hung up. I went back to my spreadsheet. Looking back, I understand now that the moment I asked Marcus to handle the communication with the extended family was the moment I handed him the material for a story. I was too focused on the logistics to see it at the time. I simply thought I was dividing the work sensibly. I would handle the money and the reservations. He would handle the family scheduling. What I did not account for was that handling the communication with the family is how you become the person the family associates with the thing being communicated. The planning took 18 months from the first deposit to the departure date, $14,000 accumulated across 72 paychecks, set aside with the consistency of someone who is committed to a specific destination and does not look at the account balance as an option but as an obligation. The logistics were the kind of complexity I handled professionally every day, which made them manageable but not easy. 11 people across 3 cities, 4 of them elderly relatives with medical considerations that had to be factored into the flight duration and the hotel room accessibility. I researched the accessible rooms at the hotel specifically for my grandmother and her sister, both in their 80s, both with mobility concerns that needed to be taken seriously. I chose a hotel with a ground floor pool access that neither of them would need to navigate stairs to reach. I built a shared itinerary document with the day-by-day breakdown of every activity, with alternatives noted for days when someone might not feel up to the planned excursion. I included the phone numbers of the local medical facilities near our hotel. I researched which restaurants could accommodate my aunt's shellfish allergy and my uncle's diabetes management diet. I made reservations at each of them weeks in advance and noted the dietary accommodations in the reservation comments. I coordinated with Marcus about the family scheduling, and he handled that end, and in our conversations about it, he was helpful and engaged. He was genuinely good at working the family network, making calls, keeping people excited, building anticipation. I will give him that. He did the thing I had asked him to do, and he did it well. What I did not know was what he was saying in those calls. I found out later from my cousin Jenny, who had assumed I already knew. Marcus had been presenting the trip to the family as something he had organized, not something he had helped coordinate, something he had put together. He had accepted their gratitude without correcting them. He had let the story develop the way stories develop when you do not interrupt them. By the time we were 3 weeks from departure, the extended family believed Marcus had planned the trip. Some of them, I would learn later, believed he had paid for it too. Sixth double lead. The week before departure was the most demanding of the entire planning process. Final confirmations, weather monitoring, a last-minute hotel room issue that required an hour on the phone to resolve, the assembly of a physical information packet for each family member with their individual boarding passes, hotel confirmation numbers, the itinerary, and the local emergency contacts. 11 packets assembled at my kitchen table on a Wednesday night. The following Saturday, I flew to Hawaii separately from most of the family because I had taken an earlier flight to be at the hotel before anyone else arrived, to confirm the rooms, to handle any issues before they became anyone else's experience of the trip. I stood at the front desk of that hotel, checking the family in for over an hour before Marcus arrived with the group from the later flight. He walked into the lobby at the front of the group of relatives, talking and laughing, generating the energy he always generated in a crowd. My aunts were smiling. My cousins were looking around the lobby with the particular delight of people who have arrived somewhere beautiful. My parents walked in behind him, my mother's eyes moving immediately around the space and then to me, where they stopped. She said nothing. She crossed the lobby and hugged me, and it was a longer hug than she usually gave, the kind with more information in it than a brief embrace. And then she stepped back and looked at my face for a moment with an expression I could not quite read, and she said,
"Everything looks beautiful, Lily. You did a wonderful job."
She said it quietly, just to me, not loud enough to reach the group that had gathered around the front desk, where Marcus was speaking to the check-in staff with the casual authority of someone who had arrived to claim something arranged for him. I thanked her. She held my gaze a second longer than usual before turning to help my grandmother with her bag. The welcome dinner was that evening at the hotel restaurant I had booked for the group 3 months earlier. I had pre-selected a menu, confirmed the table arrangement, arranged for a small floral centerpiece to be placed at my parents' seats because it was also their wedding anniversary that week. I had not told anyone about the anniversary detail. It was just a thing I had noticed when I was planning and had incorporated quietly into the evening without mentioning it. Marcus noticed the flowers when we sat down. He looked at them, then at my parents, and then he said,
"Oh, happy anniversary. I had them put flowers on your seats."
He said it smoothly, without hesitation, without anything on his face that suggested he was saying something other than the truth. My mother looked at the flowers and then at Marcus and smiled, and I sat down at the end of the table and did not say anything at all. The welcome dinner unfolded with the warmth of a family reunion that has been long anticipated. The restaurant was good. I had chosen it carefully and the food arrived correctly and everyone had what they needed and nobody had to manage a dietary emergency because I had managed it in advance through the reservation system. For the first hour, I sat at my end of the table and ate and talked with my cousin Jenny beside me and felt the particular contentment of watching something I had spent a long time building actually work as it was supposed to work. Then the toasts began. This was informal, not planned. Someone picked up their glass and then someone else did, and a mood moved naturally into the kind of celebratory acknowledgement that happens when families gather for something they have been looking forward to and the first evening delivers on the anticipation. My Uncle Tony stood up first. He was my father's older brother, a loud and affectionate man who had always been the unofficial family master of ceremonies at gatherings like this. And he raised his glass and looked down the table at Marcus, and he said,
"To Marcus, the man who made this happen, who got this whole family to paradise and didn't let any of us say no. You are the best son, the best nephew, and the hero of this family."
The table applauded. Marcus raised his glass with a modest smile, the kind of smile that accepted the praise without technically claiming it, which is a very particular skill. My father clapped him on the shoulder. My aunts were nodding. I raised my glass with the rest of the table. I had trained myself a long time ago in the management of a face that does not show what it is feeling when the feeling is not one that would be useful to display, and I called on that training now and held the glass and kept my expression exactly where it needed to be. My Aunt Patricia went next, and she said what she had to say, and what she had to say was also about Marcus, how thoughtful he was, how it took real effort to put something like this together, How their parents must be so proud. My other uncle nodded along. My cousin said they couldn't agree more. The word hero was used 3 times before the first course arrived. I sat at the end of the table and looked at the ocean through the restaurant window and reminded myself that I had not planned this trip to be thanked for it. I had planned it because my parents had mentioned Hawaii for 30 years, and I had the means and the will to give it to them. The giving was the thing, not the receiving of credit for the giving. I had told myself this for the entire 18 months of the planning, and I believed it in the part of myself that was reasonable and adult and at peace with complexity. In the other part, the younger and less resolved part, I felt something heavier. Not rage, not even anger exactly. Something closer to grief. The grief of a person who has poured themselves into something and is sitting inside it feeling like a stranger. My mother had been quiet. She was sitting midway down the table, between my father and her sister, and she had participated in the conversation around her while the toasts were happening, but she had not added to them. She had not raised her glass at Marcus. She had simply watched, with the particular expression she wore when she was taking something in and not yet ready to respond to it, and she had said nothing. Until she did. Let me pause here for just a moment. Have you ever sat in a room and watched someone receive recognition for something you did not because they took it forcibly, but because the structure of your family made it possible for them to stand in front of the thing you built and have people assume it was theirs? Drop that in the comments. I read every single one, and knowing that this particular experience is not mine alone is something that has helped me more than I can say. If this story is landing somewhere real for you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Because what my mother did next is something that needed 30 years to arrive at, and when it arrived, it changed everything. My mother was not an impulsive person. She was not someone who spoke in the heat of a moment or who made scenes at family gatherings, both of which were things she had a genuine distaste for. She was careful, measured, more interior than exterior, the kind of person who thought about something for a long time before she said it and who, when she finally said it precisely. She had known the truth of the vacation since before it began. She had known because I had needed to discuss certain logistics with her early in the planning my parents' passport information, their travel insurance requirements, the details of my grandmother's mobility needs which required a conversation with her before I could make certain hotel decisions. She knew I had been saving for 18 months. She knew the deposit confirmations came to my email address. She knew because she paid the kind of attention to her children that parents pay when they have spent decades watching closely and have stopped expecting the watching to require explanation. She had watched Marcus accept the credit at check-in when my uncle said something about how well he had organized everything, and she had said nothing. She had watched the flower moment at the table, and she had said nothing. She had listened to my Uncle Tony's toast and 3 variations of the word hero, and she had said nothing. I understood later that she had been making a decision. She had been deciding whether this was the moment, whether this room was ready, whether she was ready, whether the cost of saying the thing was worth the value of it being said. She had been running the calculation with the speed of someone who had spent 30 years watching her daughter contribute to this family in silence, and had finally arrived at the edge of what she was willing to let go unremarked. She picked up her water glass and tapped it twice against her fork. Not loudly, just enough to produce a sound that carried down the table. The conversations around her settled. People turned toward her the way they turned toward someone who did not typically ask for the room's attention and who therefore had it completely when they did. She looked down the table slowly, taking in each face, the way she looked at things when she had made a decision and was taking a moment before executing it. Then she said,
Before anyone else speaks tonight, I want to ask this table something, and I am going to ask it as a real question, because I would like a real answer. Does anyone here know who actually paid for this vacation?
The table went quiet. Not an awkward quiet, not a hostile quiet, a still quiet, the kind that comes when a room understands it is being asked something that has a specific answer and does not yet know what it is. My Uncle Tony looked at Marcus. My Aunt Patricia looked at Marcus. My Aunt Patricia looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the table. My mother looked at no one for a moment. Then she looked at me, at the end of the table, and she said,
Lily has been saving for 18 months. $14,000. Every flight, every hotel room, every dinner reservation. the luau, the snorkeling, the anniversary flowers on our plates. Every single detail of this trip was planned and paid for by your cousin, your niece, your sister. I wanted this family to know that before one more person stood up and said the word hero, without knowing who it belonged to.
The table was completely silent. My father, sitting beside her, was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just received information that reorganized something significant in his understanding of the evening and possibly of the past 18 months. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at Marcus. Nobody said anything for a moment that felt much longer than a moment. And then my grandmother, from her seat near the head of the table, began to applaud. Slowly at first, with her small, precise hands, and then my aunt picked it up, and then someone else. And then the sound moved through the table, and I sat at the end of it and cried in a way I had not cried in a very long time. The immediate aftermath of what my mother said was the kind of complicated that comes when a family receives true information they were not prepared for and are still seated together at a dinner table with food in front of them and no clear script for what happens next. My Uncle Tony was the first to speak after the applause settled. He set his glass down and looked at me from his end of the table with an expression I had not seen on his face before in the 30 years I had known him. Something between embarrassment and a genuine warmth that was trying to find language for itself. Then he said,
Lily, I owe you an apology. I didn't know, and I should have asked before I said what I said. And I am sorry. To you, not to a table. To you specifically.
He said it directly, without softening it into a general family statement, and the directness of it landed somewhere in me that I appreciated more than the toast itself had hurt. I thanked him. He nodded. There was a particular honesty in the exchange that came from its being uncomplicated by anyone else's presence in it. My cousins were talking quietly among themselves. My aunts were absorbing. My father was still looking between my mother and me with the expression of a man processing several things simultaneously. Then Marcus spoke. He had been quiet since my mother's words, quieter than I had ever seen him at a family dinner. And when he finally spoke, his voice had a quality I did not recognize from him. Something small in it, contracted rather than expansive. The sound of someone who has been taking up a great deal of space and has just understood something about the nature of that space.
Mama's right. Lily did everything. I should have said that from the beginning, and I didn't. And sitting here right now, I don't fully understand why I let it go as long as I did.
He said it to the table. Not specifically to me, which I noticed, but he said it, which I also noticed, and I understood that the two things where he directed it and the fact of its being said were separate matters that I was going to have to hold separately. My father finally found his words. He looked at me from across the table, and his face had the open, slightly undone quality it only wore when something had reached past the composure he maintained in family gatherings, and he said,
Lily, $14,000 and 18 months, and you never said a word? Why didn't you tell us?
I looked at my father across the table in the restaurant I had booked in the hotel I had chosen in the place my parents had wanted to visit for 30 years, and I said,
Because I wanted it to be a gift, Dad. Not something you felt you had to pay back or thank me for in advance. I just wanted you to have the trip.
He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at my mother, and something passed between them in the silent language of 40 years of marriage, and he turned back to me and he nodded once, slowly, with the quality of a man who has received something significant and is taking the receiving of it seriously. My mother found me after dinner, on the hotel balcony that opened off the lobby. I had stepped out to have a moment alone with the ocean and the night air, the way I always needed a moment alone after something large had happened. She came and stood beside me at the railing without asking whether I wanted company. That was always her approach. She did not ask. She simply arrived and made herself available and waited to see what the other person needed. It was a form of attentiveness that I had always recognized and appreciated even when I found it difficult to receive. We stood in silence for a while. The ocean was doing what the ocean does at night, which is be large and dark and entirely indifferent to the things that have just happened in a restaurant 30 feet away. And I found that indifference comforting. Then she said,
I should have said something the moment I realized what was happening. When Marcus accepted the credit at the front desk, and I saw your face. I saw your face, Lily, and I did not say anything. And I want to tell you why.
I turned to look at her. She was still looking at the ocean, in the way she looked at things when she was being honest rather than performing honesty, which required not making eye contact because honesty sometimes needed the freedom of not being watched. She said she had been afraid of making a scene. She had been afraid of embarrassing Marcus in front of the family. She had been doing the calculation she always did, the cost of speaking against the cost of staying quiet, and she had decided to wait for the right moment, and the right moment had taken the entire dinner to arrive. Then she turned and looked at me, and she said,
I waited too long. I know I waited too long. But I want you to know that I saw everything you did for this family. Not just the trip, Lily, but everything, for years. And I am not going to let it go unsaid anymore. Not by me, and not by anyone else in this family if I can help it.
Those two sentences reached somewhere deep in me that I had not known needed reaching until they reached it. I did not respond immediately. I stood at the railing and let the words settle the way things settle when they arrive in the right place at the right time and do not need to be moved or examined, just received. After a while, I said that it had meant everything, what she had done at the table, that it was the best thing anyone had done for me in as long as I could remember. She put her hand over mine on the railing. She did not say anything else. We stood together looking at the ocean for a long time, and the night was warm and the sound of the water was the right sound for that moment. And I felt something that had been held very tightly in me for a very long time begin, slowly, to release. Marcus came to find me the following morning. I was on the beach, early, before most of the family had come down, sitting in one of the chairs the hotel set out at the water's edge and watching the light change on the ocean as the sun finished rising. He sat down in the chair beside me without asking. He had a coffee cup in each hand, and he set one on the armrests beside me, and I accepted it because it was coffee and it was early and the gesture was real, even if the conversation it preceded was going to be uncomfortable. We sat without talking for a few minutes, which was unusual for Marcus, who typically filled silences with sound before they had the chance to become anything on their own. The fact that he did not fill this one told me he had come with something prepared. He said,
I have been lying awake since last night, trying to understand when exactly I decided it was okay to let people think I did what you did. And I don't have a clean answer, Lily, but I have an honest one, which is that the credit felt good, and correcting it would have felt bad. And I chose the thing that felt good.
He said it without dressing it up, which was the most honest thing I had ever heard from him and which cost him something I could see in the way his face looked. After he said it, a kind of relief mixed with something more uncomfortable, the expression of someone who has said a true thing and now has to sit in the room with it. I looked at my brother, and I felt the full weight of 30 years of a family dynamic, him at the center, me at the edges, both of us shaped by something neither of us had designed. The resentment I had been managing for the past 18 hours was real, but so was the love, and so was the understanding that people who have always been seen tend to develop a specific and often invisible dependency on being seen that they have never had to examine because they have never had to go without it. I said,
I know why you did it, Marcus. What I need you to understand is what it cost. Not just this trip, but all the trips. All the things I have handled for this family that went the same way, quietly and without anyone asking who did them.
He was quiet for a while. The ocean was still doing what oceans do, indifferent and enormous, and a bird moved along the waterline with a purposeful economy of motion that I found myself watching while I waited for him to respond.
I hear you. And I am going to spend a long time making sure I actually understand it. Not just agree with it. Those are not the same thing, and I know the difference. And I owe you the real version.
He said it looking at the water. I received it as what it was, not a resolution, not a repair, but a genuine opening. The door that neither of us had pushed before, pushed for the first time. We finished our coffee. The family started coming down to the beach, and the rest of the vacation began. The 2 weeks in Hawaii were, in every practical sense, what I had spent 18 months building them to be. The logistics held. The elderly relatives navigated the accessible routes without difficulty. The luau was everything my parents had wanted from it, my mother dancing with my father at the edge of the stage while the family watched and took photographs. The snorkeling tour produced the specific joy of people who have never seen an ocean reef up close encountering one for the first time and losing their composure over it. The road to Hannah Drive was long and winding and delivered on every photograph I had seen of it. My Uncle Tony made a point of finding me on the third day, alone, without the rest of the family around. He had been thinking about the welcome dinner, he said, and he wanted to say something properly. He said,
You gave this family something we didn't know we needed, Lily. And you gave it in a way that was completely about us and not at all about you. And that kind of giving is rare. And I want to make sure you know I see it and I honor it, and I will not make the same mistake again.
I thanked him. And I meant the thanks, because Tony was not a man who said things he did not mean, and being honored by someone who genuinely meant it felt entirely different from being overlooked by someone who simply had not thought to look. The dynamics in the family over those 2 weeks were different from any family gathering I could remember. People asked me questions, included me in conversations, noticed when I said something and responded to it as though I had said something worth responding to. My cousins involved me in their plans for excursions rather than telling me what they had decided. Small things, but the accumulation of them mattered. My mother was at the center of most of it, quietly, in the way she was at the center of things when she chose to be. She did not require another dramatic moment. The moment at the welcome dinner had been sufficient. What she did for the rest of the trip was demonstrate, through consistent attention and consistent acknowledgement, that what she had said was not a one-evening intervention, but a change in the way she intended to operate going forward. On the last night of the trip, the family gathered on the beach at sunset. My grandmother had made her way down in her chair, which took some assistance, in which she accepted with the dignity of someone who had been managing the inconvenience of a body that no longer did what she asked of it for long enough to have made peace with it. She sat at the front of the gathered family and looked at the ocean the way people look at things they are seeing for what might be the last time and want to see properly. My father gave a toast. He stood in the sand with the sunset behind him, and he looked out at the family, and he talked about what the trip had meant. And then he looked at me specifically and he said,
Everything you are looking at tonight, the hotel, the people, the 2 weeks, none of it would exist without your sister, your cousin, your daughter. Lily made this happen from nothing, and she made it happen out of love. And our family is not going to forget that.
He said it simply, without ceremony, in the straightforward way he said things that mattered. The family applauded. My grandmother reached out and found my hand from her chair and held it without looking at me. Just held it, and I stood in the sand looking at the Pacific Ocean in the place my parents had dreamed about for 30 years, and felt the particular completeness of a gift that had been given and received, and finally acknowledged in the right order. It has been 14 months since the Hawaii trip. 14 months of things being different in the specific, imperfect, genuine way that family things become different when a true thing has been said in a room and cannot be unsaid. Marcus and I have had more honest conversations in the past 14 months than in the previous decade. We are not suddenly the close siblings. I perhaps once wished we could be. The gap between us is real and was built over a long time and will close slowly if it closes. But he calls me now in a different register than before. He asks what I think, rather than announcing what he has decided. He gives credit in the family conversations where credit is due, which I know because Jenny, who is always in those conversations, tells me so. My mother calls me every other week with no logistical purpose, just to talk. She asks questions and waits for actual answers and does not move on until the answers have been given and received. It is a new habit, and she is building it with the consistency of someone who understands they are doing it late, and that doing it late is not the same as not doing it. My father sent me a card last month, not for a birthday or a holiday, just a card, with a note inside in his handwriting. It said, I think about Hawaii every day. I think about you every day. Thank you for giving us the best trip of our lives, and thank you for being exactly who you are. I keep it on my desk. I am still the organizer in this family. That is not going to change, because a moment at a dinner table in Hawaii changed the context around it. I am good at organizing things and I love the people I organize them for, and those two facts together will continue to produce the same result they have always produced. But I do it differently now. Not silently, not invisibly. I mention what I am doing while I am doing it. I let the people I love know that someone who loves them is making choices on their behalf, and that the making of those choices has a cost and a value that they are allowed to acknowledge. It is a small shift. It changes everything. See, if you have stayed with me through this whole story, I want to say something to you before we finish. If you are the person in your family who gives without announcement, who plans without fanfare, who loves through sustained invisible effort while the visible credit goes somewhere else, I want to tell you something. It took me 30 years and a family dinner in Hawaii and one sentence from my mother to finally believe that giving is real whether it is acknowledged or not. But you are allowed to want the acknowledgement. You are allowed to need it. Giving freely does not obligate you to give invisibly. Loving generously does not require you to erase yourself from the love. The people who should see you may be closer to seeing you than you think. They may have been watching for a long time without knowing how to say what they see. They may need someone to give them the moment, the right room, the right table, the right question asked out loud before they can say it. My mother gave herself that moment at a welcome dinner on the first night of a Hawaii trip. One question, two sentences. $14,000 and 30 years of watching her daughter go unacknowledged, finally spoken in a room that needed to hear it. It cost her the discomfort of a scene she would normally have avoided. What she got in return was a family that understood something true about itself. What I got was the one thing I had not known how to ask for, being seen, clearly, by the people I had been giving to for my entire adult life. You are worth being seen. The work you do for the people you love is worth being named. And the person who sees you may already be sitting at the table, waiting for the right moment to say so. Hold on for that moment. And when it comes, let yourself receive it. Thank you for being here through this whole story. If it meant something to you, please like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me about the moment someone in your life finally said the thing that needed to be said. I read every single one. Until next time, do the work, love the people, and let yourself be known for both.